Hi everyone, Kurt here again for another video for our course. And today we're going to be looking at teaching grammar and vocabulary. This will be the last one on specific skills. So in conclusion, or in summary, I guess, we've done teaching listening, teaching speaking, teaching reading, teaching writing, and now we're going to look at grammar and vocabulary. Now I'm going to talk specifically about the two, but just keep in mind that I hope what you've come to see is that it's really hard to separate grammar and vocabulary from the other skills, because obviously grammar and vocabulary are the building blocks of language. So anytime you're teaching speaking, grammar and vocabulary are a part of it, and that's the same for the other skills as well. But since we are looking at theory of teaching, we need to break these down specifically so we can look at what's going on and maybe what are some good strategies or methods that we can use for instruction. Okay, so let me get going here. Okay, so before we start the actual teaching of grammar, you need to be aware that there are three dimensions of grammar that we need to be concerned about in the classroom. So of course we've got the form. This is the observable structural components, the phonemes, the graphemes, the morpheme, flexional morphemes, syntactic patterns, and on and on. Okay, this is typically what we think about when we say we're teaching grammar. And a lot of times you will hear me in class say, are we focusing on form or are we focusing on meaning? So when we talk about the form, it's these components here. Okay. But obviously meaning also plays an important part in grammar as well. And here we're looking at the semantic level. So that could be the lexical meaning or it could be the grammatical meaning. But there is a third dimension, and the third dimension is the use. And this is when the meanings may change across different contexts. So I'll give you an example sentence. If I say, if you read this sentence without any context, without hearing the speaker's voice, what does it mean to you? Now it could be get out of here, which means I want someone to leave the room. Or it could be get out of here, which means maybe I heard some surprising fact and I'm trying to tell you that I don't believe you. Okay, and on and on. There could be many different ways to say this. And this will happen with sentences, but it can also happen at the single word level as well. So all three are important, and I'll probably repeat that a few times throughout. Okay, so let's look at grammar and discourse. So remember, discourse is speech or writing with internal relationships of form and meaning that relate to a function or purpose and an audience in a particular context. So that's the goal, right? We want students to be able to say something or write something. So we're focusing on output here today. But it can't just be about the form, right? The meaning is just as important. Also is the success of the function and the delivery to the right audience based on the context that they are in. And grammar, of course, plays an integral part in this. Okay, when we're talking about context, then what are we talking about? So obviously it's the speaker or the writer, but just as importantly, it is the audience. What communication takes place before and after the sentence, the implied and the literal meanings, kind of like in my get out of here example, the styles, the registers, so what type of speaking or writing style and what type of register, should it be formal, should it be informal, and are there any other alternative forms available? Okay, so all of this will be included in context. All right, so at the very beginning of grammar, learning grammar instruction, what we're going to describe them as or define them as is emergent grammar. So when we look at grammar in this way, what we say is that grammar emerges through repeated use. So you think about this sentence. I bet you all can remember or have the experience of learning grammar in the classroom, and the teacher teaches you the rule, and you understand what the teacher is saying, but maybe when you try to talk, it doesn't really come out that naturally, right? Or on a test, maybe you just can't quite remember what the teacher said, or they give you some kind of trick question and you're not able to produce it in the correct way. That's because even though you may have an understanding of it, you're not actually able to successfully use it until you practice using it over and over again. So we have this term called grammaring, and it means using grammar in real world communicative context. Now, this is important because if you want someone to become fluent in a particular grammar structure, they have to be able to use it, and they have to use it many times. This goes back to the principle of automaticity. So it treats grammar as a skill to develop, not only knowledge. Of course, knowledge is important, but just knowing the rule doesn't mean you're able to use it properly. So this is the process of using grammar constructions accurately, meaningfully, and appropriately. So that's our three, right? Our form, our meaning, and our use. Okay, so these are very, very important when you get into the classroom. You're a full-time teacher, and now you're under time pressures and you're under all kinds of pressure to make sure your students learn this stuff. You have to remember that it's not just the knowledge. They have to be able to construct them accurately and meaningfully and appropriately. Okay, now we're going to look at a few different approaches to how you can teach form-focused instruction. Okay, so focusing on the grammar itself. And the first is an explicit presentation of forms. You're actually explicitly showing the students the grammar. Now, I'm of the belief that spending too much time on rules and having students memorize the rules, while it can be useful at times, I don't believe that it is the most successful way, because I believe you have to really just jump in and use the language, and you'll learn grammar that way as well. But I'm not saying that it's not good to do this. You should still explicitly present the language forms to the students, because it helps them develop a metalinguistic awareness of a rule, and that can be carried deductively or inductively. And I'm going to talk about those two in a minute. Okay, so deductive. Now, when you teach deductively, it means you are actually focusing on the grammar itself, and you are showing the students, here is the form, and this is how it works. And then probably afterwards, you let them practice. So, very simply put, the teacher begins the lesson by presenting the grammar focus. So today we're going to focus on the simple past tense. Then the teacher gives examples to the students, and then you follow up at the end with an explicit rule explanation. So now you've got your chart on the blackboard or on the screen, and you've got your V plus ED or whatever it is that you're teaching the students, and you show them exactly how it's constructed. Okay, this is deductive. Inductive is kind of the opposite, if there is such a thing, in which you try to elicit grammatical information from the students by providing examples, but you're not teaching them the rule explicitly. You just give them the form in examples. So you give them some text or a story that has the form in it, and you hope that students learn it just by interacting with the language. But you don't specifically teach them the rule. They learn it on their own. Okay, so before I move on to the next one, just some suggestions for enhancing your grammatical explanations. Okay, so if you are teaching grammar, now first of all, this one's not on the screen, but it just occurred to me. A lot of teachers now will use mostly Chinese to teach the English grammar rules. I'm not saying that it's wrong. But just remember, the more English you use, the better your students will be at English. However, I know that if you teach something abstract, you're going to have to use some Chinese as well. But more importantly than that, when you are teaching any kind of rule, you need to keep your explanation brief and simple. Do not make it too complicated. And use visuals to explain, because some students are not good listeners. And I don't mean they don't pay attention. I mean their learning style is not auditory. Maybe they are better visual, or maybe they are better hands-on. So use charts, use graphs, use posters, whatever helps. Add colors to the different parts of speech. Use clear, unambiguous examples. This is so important. And then do not overly focus on exceptions. We know that in English, there are many exceptions to the rule. Just like when you teach the past tense. Okay, take a verb, you want to change it to the past tense, add ed. Oh, except for all of these irregular verbs. Don't give too many exceptions when you are teaching the rule, because you will really confuse them. Focus on the rule first, give examples of it, and then later on when they get it, then you can start focusing more on some exceptions. Okay, last one, also very important, especially for new teachers. Don't teach something you're unsure of. If you get a grammar question or something comes up and you're not 100% sure, tell the students you'll get back to them next time, and then look it up, do your homework, and make sure you really understand it. Okay, so back to our form-focused instruction. Okay, another way to look at this is to do an implicit presentation of the forms. So in this way, you do not explain the rules, okay? The target form is included in the class materials, and students learn through usage in appropriate context. So just like I said at the beginning of this implicit slide, 2 slides ago, you never teach the rule. You don't explain it to them. You just let them interact over and over and over again with materials that use it. Okay, so here's an example of that. Maybe you can tell by reading the text on the screen what is the particular sentence pattern or grammar structure or grammar form that I'm trying to teach my students. It's quite obvious because every single sentence uses it, right? I'm speaking now. I'm not reading. Suji is sitting, and so on and so on. And you can see there's a few different examples here. The actions they are doing, the examples they're not doing, the actions they are not doing, and then even down below, we've got more abstract, like where are you living right now and where are you staying? Now, what you would do is you would let the students use this, and then perhaps afterwards you ask them some questions. What are you doing now? And maybe they have implicitly learned to add ing. And then at the very end, if you feel like they didn't get it or not, you either give them more examples, or at that time you can start to look at the rules. Okay, now another type is called focus on form. So we had deductive, we had inductive, and now we have something called focus on form. Okay, so here is when you induce students' incidental learning. Okay, so that was our implicit, by drawing their attention to forms while performing communicative activities. So in this way, students need to notice the forms and their lack of ability in it. They notice the gap. Okay, so you give your students some kind of communicative activity, and while they're performing it or at the end of it, you look at the particular grammar points that they didn't get or they're missing, and then you draw their attention to it. Okay, so what are the benefits of focus on form instruction? This is what I was talking about, the one on the previous slide. It's similar to natural language acquisition because you're not focused on the rules. You're focused on the language that they use while they're communicating. It promotes the idea of something called interlanguage development. In second language in second language acquisition, SLA, we have this term called interlanguage. That is the language that students use in the process of their learning. So when they learn a new grammatical rule or structure, they may not use it correctly, but the language that they use at that time is called interlanguage. And what we know is students will start to experiment with the language. They will use it, probably incorrectly at first. And then the more they use it, the more it starts to correct itself. And I'll give you a small example. Probably you can think about you can think about articles. Okay, so it's specifically the articles of a and the. Probably in the beginning, students won't use any articles, right? I have hamburger instead of I have a hamburger. But then later on, they start to add articles, but they get a and the mixed up all the time. They use the wrong one. Like I have the hamburger, which should be I have a hamburger. And then over time, they eventually figure out that there's a difference between the two, and they start to understand when to use a and when to use the. This entire process is their interlanguage and how they get it right and wrong until finally they get to the correct stage. Okay, third benefit is that it allows students a chance to try out the language without being overwhelmed with rules. You know how it feels when you throw the rules at students, or when your teacher threw the rules at you at the beginning. The more rules you learn, the harder it is to actually focus on the language you want to create. And it actually creates intrinsic motivation, which we like, because students will discover the rules on their own instead of being told them. It's just, if you do it this way, where students implicitly learn by you letting them interact with these particular types of grammar that you want them to learn, and you ask them questions so that you hope they can focus on the language and the grammar. You have to be patient because they're going to make a lot of mistakes, but those mistakes will lead to accuracy in the future after they get more and more chances to practice them. Okay. One thing to notice though, or one thing to pay attention to, if you do this implicit way, the learners have to compare their answers to the correct form at the end of a task. So no matter what language they produce, you have to give them an example of a correct version of that language. And they have to notice the gap between their answer and the correct answer. Not you tell them. Students have to see it on their own. And once they see that what I said and what the real answer is, and it's different, then at that point in time, they will know, oh, so I need to improve. And inside their brain, every time they talk, they will self-evaluate what they're saying, and they will start to make improvements. Okay. So now we'll move on to feedback on errors. I'm not going to spend a lot of time in this video on that, but just a few general comments. When students make mistakes, you should give a variety of different feedback options. So we have something called recasting, there's self-correction, meta-linguistic explanation, and on and on and on. There are many different ways to correct students, too many to discuss here. But what's also important, so mix it up. Don't just do the same thing every time, because different students have different ways that help them the most. Keep the communicative flow going, which means don't stop them every time when they're talking and correct their grammar. Let them get it out, and only correct them or give them feedback when you really need to, or at least at the end of what they're saying. But really try to maximize student self-correction. If students are able to find their own mistakes, that is the biggest advantage, or that's the most successful way for them to improve in the future. And then, of course, consider affective factors. Don't hurt their self-confidence when you are giving feedback on errors. If you make them feel stupid, or you make them feel bad or embarrassed, this will hurt them in the long term. And then try to find a balance between local and global errors. Local are those small mistakes that don't affect the meaning. So if I say to you, yesterday I slept on my bed instead of I slept, even though I made a mistake, I can still understand. And what I'm trying to say is you don't always have to correct those small mistakes. But if they say something or they write something and you cannot understand what it is they're trying to say, then you definitely need to give feedback on that because what their message is not clear. Now, I'm not saying ignore local errors, but you need to balance between the two. Okay, another important term before we move on to other parts of this is there is this term called the lexico-grammatical approach. And this is very important because this theory is that lexis and grammar are inherently connected parts of a single entity, which means you cannot separate them. You cannot actually separate the individual words with grammar, especially in English. We know that grammar is a meaning-making resource to describe grammatical categories by reference to what they mean, okay? But we know that grammatical structures are lexically bound. Lexical items have grammatical features, right? So you can't separate these two. Even though we like to separate teaching vocabulary and teaching grammar, actually these two are hand in hand. You can't have one without the other. Okay, just wanted to mention this one. Okay, so some principles for teaching grammar as we always go through. All three dimensions, remember I said form, meaning, and use, they should all be focused on. Use a lexico-grammatical approach to present new linguistic items. So the vocabulary and the grammar together. Learners need to practice and use these forms in communicative context, okay? It's really important. Allow students to have both input and output. Now, I mentioned before, deductive and inductive, they can both be used depending on your goal and your context. Incidental focus on forms helps learners' errors. Helps when learners' errors are treated when engaged in meaningful communication. Okay, corrective feedback should include both implicit and explicit forms. Explicit grammar lessons and implicit grammar, there's a mistake there, integrated into communicative activities are both viable depending on the context and the learner's needs. And your instruction must consider learners' differences, of course. Okay, so some grammar techniques. Now, I'm not going to give examples of all of these because I believe that some of them are self-explanatory and others you have done many times. But I am going to show you a couple, okay? So, of course, you can use charts, objects, maps, drawings to teach the grammar. You can teach the grammar through dialogues and conversations. You can do something called input enhancement, which I will show you an example of. You can do an input flood, which I'll also show you an example. You can do input processing, where you more explicitly focus on the form and not the meaning at the same time. I think this is something that teachers in Taiwan do a lot. And then we have dictogloss. So dictogloss is if you give your students a text and it's full of the grammar that you want them to learn, like the previous slide that I showed you with all of the present continuous tense on it, you could give them a paragraph like that and they read it 2 or 3 times and then you take the paragraph away and they have to rewrite it. So you're hoping that they will continue to use the present continuous tense. Okay, so let me show you a couple here. This is input enhancement. So here's an example. The text on the left-hand side of the screen is exactly what the students would get. So you can see the present perfect is used here and it's bolded for them to see it, but the teacher doesn't actually teach the rules of it. So you see the instructions, please read the following text. Then in groups of 2, discuss the following questions. And you can see some of these questions still have the perfect tense, right? Has, anything ever. What do you think has been? Okay, and then a couple of meaning questions afterwards. So the goal or the hope of something like this is that because you put students in pairs and you give them some meaningful questions to discuss and answer, by reading this text that has the grammar bolded, they're going to focus on it and they're going to try to figure out why they're bolded and why does it say has, told, have, looked. So after they answer the questions, then if you want, you can assess what they learned. You can ask the students, okay, so who can tell me why does the sentence say the teacher has told me instead of the teacher told me? Why does it say I have looked? What's the rule here? How is this grammar put together? And have the students tell you what they learned by doing this. It's a way for them to learn it on their own implicitly. Okay, and then the other one that I said I was going to show you is called input flood. So here's definite and indefinite articles. And if you read through this one, you can see that it is intentionally written to show the difference between the definite and indefinite articles. So look, a chipmunk. And then the next time we get to chipmunk, the chipmunk. Okay, the chipmunk, the chipmunk. Okay, and then here we have some branches. And then the branches. I don't know if there's any more branches. No. Okay, a big tree. And then the tree. So again, the hope here is that students read this and then you can ask them some questions after that intentionally has them where they need to use the articles in order to answer. And again, as a teacher, when you look at their answers, you can assess whether or not they successfully learned this rule. And then if not, you can do it again, or you can start to ask them some specific questions like, okay, everybody, have a look at this short story and tell me why it's a chipmunk, but then later it's the chipmunk. Why is it a tree and then the tree? And then have the students tell you what the rule is. I can guarantee you if the students figure the rule out by themselves, they will be much more successful in remembering it than if you just tell them what the rule is and then you tell them they have to memorize it. Oh my goodness, let's skip that slide. Okay, sorry about that. So let's move on. Sorry, just ignore what just happened there. Let's move on now to vocabulary, okay? So teaching vocabulary, it can be considered somewhat controversial whether or not you can actually teach it or whether students should just learn it incidentally, but I believe that it's more important that you teach them in a way that they can learn vocabulary on their own. So here is some strategies for teaching. One thing that I want to say before I move on is just having them memorize lists of vocabulary, in my opinion, is the least effective way to teach it. Okay, so first point here, you should have actual class time for vocabulary learning. What you should be doing is helping them learn the vocabulary in context, not in a list. That those words should be in text that they can see how it's used. Engage in unplanned vocabulary teaching. This is very important. When a word comes up that students don't know, don't just give them the Chinese meaning. Stop and spend a little time, have students read the word, have them read it in context, have them guess, try to get them to tell you what the word means, and then have some short discussion about it. And as I mentioned already, you need to encourage them to develop their own word learning strategies. Okay, so here are a few. I think there's 3 or 4 that I'm going to show. So the first word learning strategy that students should have is word building. They need to learn how to do this on their own, not just by looking words up and translating them from Chinese. And you can give them tasks in class to do this. So of course, word building, they focus on the suffix. They practice word formation through exercises in which they have to add and subtract the suffixes. They have to focus on the prefixes. Same thing. You have them add prefixes, take the prefixes away, and then figure out, okay, so what does the prefix in, im, un, non, inter, what does that mean? What does that do to the meaning of the word? Okay. Roots, of course. I've got this root, help, and then I add full, I add less. What does that do to the word? What part of speech is it? Is it a verb? Is it a noun? Okay, going through like that. You can also teach them definition clues. Okay, so when they're reading a sentence, if they see parentheses, what does that mean? Usually it's a definition, right? Teach them about synonyms and antonyms. So in this sentence, a birthday is an observance. That is a remembrance of someone's day of birth, okay? Superordinates. When they see things like this, what does that mean? So we know animal, we know dog, we know lion, we know mouse. How are they connected together? Which one is the subordinate? Which one is the superordinate? Okay, third one is inference clues. So teach them how to look for these clues so that they can guess on their own. So we can look at specific clues. Like in this first one, the key word is restore. So Peru is trying to restore. I don't know what restore means. Some of its deteriorated monuments. Okay, there's the first clue. The monuments are deteriorated. So what would they try to do is something that's breaking down. And then the next one says Machu Picchu is being partly rebuilt. Restore, rebuilt. Okay. They've got what we call restatement. Sometimes you'll see this, right? Perspiration. I don't know what that means, but then afterwards, whoever's writing this knows perspiration might be a difficult word. And so we got bodily secretion of salty liquid. Everybody in the world knows what that means. Okay. And then, of course, contextual clues, like in this example, snuffled and moped, maybe not very common words. But if I look at the sentence, it's an old dog, and he sadly walked from room to room. So what would be the noises, or what would that kind of dog look like? Have students brainstorm. So anytime these kind of words show up in a text, don't just tell them what the word means. Have them use these strategies. Okay, and of course, word associations, link meaning, use collocations, things like that. Okay, some points. Teachers can't spend all their time covering all the unknown words in class, right? Students must develop their own strategies, such as questions. Like, is the word countable or uncountable? Is there a particular preposition? Is it a formal word? Does it have a positive or negative connotation? Have students always asking these type of questions. Okay, and that's it, everybody. So that's it for grammar and vocabulary. I will see you next time. Bye-bye.